to have you today. And I want to introduce Shauna from Keys to Literacy, and I'm going to let her tell you a little bit about herself. She's the Vice President for Professional Learning. And Shauna, I'm going to let you take it away.
Sure. Thanks so much, Carrie. Welcome, everyone. I'm Shauna Cotty from Keys to Literacy, and I'm here to do the next hour with all of you webinar style on one of my favorite writing topics. But little bit of my own background. I've been at Keys to Literacy for 17 years at this point. After spending some time as a classroom teacher in the 4th through 9th grade band, I spent time as a literacy interventionist in the K to 12 span, and then was lucky enough to collide with Joan Sedita about 20 years ago and really be mentored by her as I was doing things within my own classroom, and then eventually came on board with Keys. So I don't have my own classroom anymore, but a lot of the work that I do for Keys is going into schools all over the place and doing teacher training and borrowing everybody else's classrooms to do model lessons and co-teaching. So I still feel really close to the classroom, in the trenches quite a bit in schools and classrooms. I just don't own a group of students day in and day out anymore. I did go ahead, just logistics. I dropped into the chat feature a PDF of the slides, or some key slides that I'm going to be sharing with you all in this webinar. So if you want to retrieve that from the chat feature, it's available there. I'm going to go ahead and screen share and switch over to full view, and we will go ahead and get started here. This is part of a series of 3, and I'm here to do part 2, which is improving adolescent writing, which we could do a whole grad course on that. So I'm going to be zooming in on a particular facet of adolescent writing, which is the writing process. So one of my favorite topics. Let's get started. I do want to point out and make a connection to, if any of you joined for the first part of this 3-part series that Joan Sedita did, my boss at Keys and my long-term mentor on the writing rope and the integration of reading and writing. We are going to be taking a strand of the writing rope, that critical thinking strand, and doing a bit of a deeper dive with it. So I'm going to take that writing process topic and we're going to dive a little deeper. And for those of you that maybe were not in that first piece with Joan, you can find info about the writing rope on our website. You can find the visual, you can find the article on keystoliteracy.com. But Joan put this together a number of years ago in a piece that she did for the IDA at that time. It's a little bit of a nod to Scarborough's rope. We were always being asked, where is the writing rope? And this is a really great framework to think about what are the components that need to be part of what's going on in a curriculum, whether that's in your school or your district. Are we addressing critical thinking, syntax, text structure, the craft of writing, transcription skills? All of these things really get woven together to create skilled writers. And one thing I really like about this visual is it represents really clearly that writing is not a monolithic thing. And we're going to be taking one piece, a bit from the critical thinking strand, and diving deeper into the writing rope. But this really honors that it's one component of what needs to go on in creating skilled writers. So we're here to do part 2, take a look at supporting the writing process. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you, you sometimes will notice down in the bottom right-hand corner, there will be a keystoliteracy.com sort of nod to the website, because on the website we have many free templates, free printables for educators. Joan's article about the writing rope graphic is on there. So many of the things you can go on there and access as free resources. So let's take a look first at our objectives for this session. I'm hoping that in this time together, we can explore how establishing clear writing beliefs, and writing process is going to be connected to this, supports a positive classroom environment. I hope we can hit some mountaintops, not a deep dive because we're just in this hour together, but in this power hour, hit a little bit of a review of the research recommendations related to the writing process, and then move on to help identify strategies and some practical approaches. At Keys to Literacy, we live in the practical for implementing a process writing approach. And then I want to end this session with giving a little bit of inspiration for how we can motivate adolescent writers when we think about authentic audiences that we can have them writing to. So, let's take a little bit of a look at how we could do some active participation. I know this is webinar style. I've been part of many webinars, both as the person giving them, but also on the receiving end, trying to keep up my own professional learning. And it really, really helps to jot some things down as you go. And one recommendation I'll make up front here is if you want to pause and take a moment to set up a really simple 2-column note with our overall topic across the top. It's going to be writing process. And then I like to think about maybe track some of your thinking in these categories. Is something that I'm sharing tonight validating something that you already use, already knew to be true? So a little validation category on the left there, I already use. Is there anything from today's session that is an aha? It's a key takeaway for you. It's sort of enlightened your understanding. And then maybe my favorite category, what are some things that you can see taking back and implementing? These might be kind of small little nuggets of how to say something to students, or they might be a big overall strategy and approach that you now think about a bit differently. Maybe an ask is for Carrie and I as we go, we can see comments in the chat feature, and I can't necessarily monitor them always in live time. But if you want to drop as you go into the chat feature that something I said is validating, or that's a great takeaway for you, or you can see yourself implementing that, we would love to hear from you all in the chat feature as we go. Okay. So I want to start off here with just a little bit of context. The things that I'm going to share with you, I want us to keep in mind the framework of the multi-tiered systems of instruction. So these suggestions are going to be tier 1 suggestions. What I'm going to go over in this webinar are things that anyone could use at any grade level. And when we think about the adolescent level, we're often talking about either 4 to 12 or 5 to 12, or some consider 6 to 12. But it becomes that switch from those primary grades over to curriculum becoming more dense, and text is getting more sophisticated. And the students in front of us have hit puberty and they have the adolescent brain kicking in. So in that 4 to 12, 5 to 12, 6 to 12 span, any grade level or any content area can implement the things that we're going to take a peek at. So these are meant to be tier 1 suggestions. And in the continuum of how we like to think about tiered systems of instruction, everybody has varied levels of student literacy skills in front of them, even in any given class. So you might be teaching 4th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, and you have students that are significantly below what you would expect for grade level. And then you have students performing above and beyond. That doesn't tend to be the masses. Sometimes you only get a couple of those at a time, but there's this continuum. And your role is really, how do we move everybody a little bit to the right? And yes, students that are on the left side of the screen here, they have more significant gaps in their literacy skills. They do need often tier 2, supplemental, more time, more repetition, more everyday examples. And many of them by the adolescent level also need tier 3. They need something that is a heavier remediation. Maybe they're in 8th grade and they're still decoding on a 2nd or a 3rd grade level. They need a tier 3 intervention for that. So one point I want to make here is that yes, our students that are falling behind grade level proficiency and expectations, often need those levels of support at the adolescent level. We can't drop those off. But there is an issue often in tier one where we want to have some real consistency and opportunity for repeated practice, really solid instruction going on in tier one. There is a collective responsibility to literacy achievement. And as students move grade to grade, subject to subject, class to class, what's going on in tier one so that tier two can actually act like a booster shot or a second dose? Oh, okay. I'm seeing Susan writing the chat feature is disabled. Is this the place to ask? So, yes, there is a little Q&A piece that Susan here on the webinar has accessed, and I can see things in that Q&A feature. So that is true. If you can access the Q&A feature, you can drop questions in there. Thank you for that clarification. Okay. So I want to kick this off here with the idea, one, that we're going to make tier one suggestions here. These are things anyone can do, any grade level, any content area, in any classroom. And there is a piece around writing beliefs that I want to kick this off with. So one piece that we know from research is that what is the classroom environment or the messaging going on in the classroom around writing? So one of the things that we often do in our trainings and our PD with teachers is establish that your writing beliefs are coming across to students, whether you're being explicit about them or implicit about them. And what I would like to suggest here is that if you get a set of writing beliefs, they end up serving like mantras, like ongoing messages in your classroom, your fifth grade classroom, your seventh grade classroom, your ninth grade classroom, that create a positive environment around writing. So here's a sample list. You can find examples of these at keystoliteracy.com. You can steal what's here and eventually create your own and customize it. But this goes up. I often have this as an anchor chart. I have it as a handout. I've had it in certain years where I used to put it in those 8x11 plastic frames and kind of put them in the middle of groups when we were writing. But establishing out of the gate for my fourth graders, seventh graders, 10th graders, writing matters. I'm going to say it. I'm going to return to that message. I have to prove it over time. But it's really important to get it up and get it established as a belief. Maybe I can convert them over time. Number two, writing is a struggle. Writing is not struggle. Whether you are in seventh grade or you won the Pulitzer Prize last year, writing is really cognitively demanding. So writing is struggle. And I want them to feel like they're in good company if writing feels like struggle. Let me show you a quick example of that. One way I get at that is I will show students how real writers, or I shouldn't say real writers, but professional writers, talk about the writing process. So let me jump back. Writing is a struggle, but it is a process. That's the focus of our webinar here. So if writing is such struggle, why do it? Because writing matters. Well, if writing is such struggle, what can I do about it? Leverage that writing is a process. So having professional writers, I follow them on social media. I follow their Instagram. I follow their Facebook pages, and they talk about all the time the weight of writing. And I showed this one to fourth graders. They all love Because of Winn-Dixie. They love KT Camillo. But look at what KT Camillo writes here. I usually rewrite a book a total of 8 or 9 times, sometimes more. So Winn-Dixie didn't just fall out of her. Kids can have a lot of fixed mindset about writing. They think that you open up a Chromebook and there's the kids that the story falls out of them, and then there's the kids that can't do that. But I usually rewrite a book a total of 8 or 9 times, sometimes more. When I'm done, I take all those drafts and I pile them up and put them in a box, and I take them to the curling collection at the University of Minnesota. That's a really cool thing. You can look it up. They archive the drafts. They make them available for people to look at, to study, to puzzle over. The drafts are meandering, desperate, coffee-stained, confused, hopeful. They're a mess. You can see just how hard writing is for me. One of the cool things that the Curlin collection does is rather than just collect product, like, look, KT Camillo wrote this great book because of Winn-Dixie, they collect writing process. So getting students to have a set of writing beliefs that are established and anchoring the environment, the classroom environment. Writing matters, writing is struggle, writing is a process. I have some other ones on this list that I love. You have to constantly consider task, audience, and purpose. Real writing happens in revision. Writing can be taught and it can be learned. It's actually the only way anybody's ever been able to do it. So getting them to see growth. But I want to focus on that red star piece. Writing is a process. I start first with writing process around establishing that that's going to become a mantra all year long that I keep leaning on. And the idea that writing is a process, there are authors that talk about this all the time. So here's a fourth grade example. But I would have my high schoolers and I would share pieces of, Dr. Angelou's interviews or things that she said. This is one of her quotes from one of her interviews. Each time I write a book, every time I face that yellow pad, the challenge is so great. I have written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody and they're going to find me out. So if Dr. Angelou is feeling like this when she writes, writing is struggle. It's okay that when students write, they feel that it is challenging. It is very cognitively taxing. I'll also share Malcolm Gladwell is a great expository text author that I often would use with high schoolers, but he talks about just get it down. Perfect is the enemy of the good. You'll never produce the perfect piece. Accept that your first couple of drafts will be bad. Just get things on the page. It emerges. You have to trust the process. Like most serious writers I know, they write many, 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 many drafts. I have an expectation that when I'm writing, it's going to change. There's no necessity getting it right the first time. So writing is a process and it is struggle. And because it is struggle, it's very cognitively taxing thing to do. We're going to leverage the writing process. So a tip I'd like to give out of the gate is establish some writing beliefs and get them up in your room and make writing process one of those mantras that you continually lean on. A lot of times students, when you say writing is a process, I'll do a quick write with them. In your own words, tell me about the stages of the writing process. They can't even really quite articulate it. So I want it up first and foremost as a mantra and something that we're going to lean on and lean into, the writing process. So if we switch here to talk a little bit about research highlights, I want to transition to why is this a really important belief and a thing to establish that we're going to lean into throughout the school year? It's very supported by research. And when we say research-based instruction around writing, all of these are things that you can get available free for you online. The Writing to Read report done by Alliance for Education, the Writing Next report done by Alliance for Ed, that's the Carnegie Corporation supporting those two reports. But then there are also the IES practice guides. They have one for elementary. They also have one for secondary. So some of it's a little crossover depending on whether you're doing fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade. But the point here being the people that study this stuff all day long and do a real meta-analysis of research, what things are really worth your time, give you a good return for your time. What are those? You can go get these reports, you can get the executive summaries, but what I'm going to do here, maybe save you a little reading time, is hit a few highlights that cement for us that the writing process is a research-based thing that we want to be integrating into the classroom regularly. So in the IES elementary report, the 4 major findings that came up as most valid across that meta-analysis of research: provide daily time for students to write, teach students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes. Number 3 is really about all those transcription skills, handwriting, word processing, spelling, and then finally create an engaged community of writers. I want to come back up to number 2 because it's making the point about writing process. So making sure that you're explicitly teaching and supporting the writing process is a research-based recommendation. When we go to the secondary report, the IES practice guide, explicitly teach appropriate writing strategies using that model practice reflect, that gradual release of responsibility model we're familiar with, the I do it, we do it, you do it. Integrate writing and reading because emphasizing those key features, how it's reciprocal, it's very helpful. Joan talked quite a bit about that in part 1 of this series, and then use assessments of student writing to inform instruction and feedback. But if we swing back up to number 1, when you really break down what this report talks about, what does it mean by appropriate writing strategies, it really gets into the detail about teaching strategies that go with the different stages of the writing process. So this recommendation is deeply connected to having the writing process going on in your classroom as a regular explicit practice. If we go to the writing next findings, there were 11 major findings from that report, and you can see them bulleted here. I won't necessarily read them all aloud, but I highlighted here in blue the ones most connected to the writing process work. So writing strategies, there's quite a bit in that recommendation in the detail of it about having the right strategies for revision, having strategies for editing. There is a whole finding about the importance of pre-writing and what types of tools, such as graphic organizers, are students able to effectively use to get ready to write. And then there is a whole finding dedicated to the process approach to writing or the writing process. So you can certainly dive into the details of these reports, but writing is a process. We want to establish that. And we know that research makes clear over and over again across different reports that having explicit instruction in the writing process going on in the classroom is key to creating stronger writers. So now, what are some practical things that you can do about that recommendation? I want to take a look at the process writing routine, or we sometimes, the letters are bolded there because we think about it as TPWR. You might have a different set of language that you use for it, but at Keys to Literacy, we use the language of think, plan, write, revise in order to establish stages of the writing process and name them for students. And what research tells us is that writers move through these identifiable stages of pre-write, what goes on before you start drafting. So the think and the plan is the pre-write. Then there's the drafting stage. So we call that the write stage, where you're actually starting to produce text. And then there is the writing belief that I hold that real writing happens in revision. So we need revision or the clean it up. So what research tells us is that there's a pre-write, there's a drafting, there's a clean it up. We use these stages, think, plan, write, revise. We actually use editing as a component of revision. Sometimes people break that out as a separate phase. And what's important here is that you want to be explicit about that writing is a process. So the recommendation I'm going to make here instructionally is that you have a common visual and a common language system. This is important because I go to schools all over the place now, and I go into different classrooms. I feel like some classrooms I do residency work in, I go to them so much. But sometimes what'll happen is in period 1, a teacher might put this visual up. Think, plan, write, revise, writers move through a process. But then students switch to the next teacher, and instead of the think stage, it's called brainstorming. And then the next teacher calls it pre-writing. And we all have a different visual and a different language system to mean the same thing. So research supports explicit instruction in the writing process. We just established that. Part of being explicit about the writing process is getting it up visually for reference and having a language system. Now, it doesn't have to be this one. You have to use the Keys to Literacy language. But I would A, get up a visual, B, get a language system going, and then make it common, grade to grade, class to class, or at least within a department. Start small if you have to. 3rd grade is using this, and now we share it with 4th grade. But that piece is important. And when we think about what happens at these stages, that students are going to strengthen their writing by moving through those identifiable stages. This is not a comprehensive list, but here are some examples. In the think stage, a writer would figure out what's my purpose here, who am I writing to, my audience. They often have to gather information, take notes. This is where, if they're writing from sources, right, they have to figure out the information first. You can't write about what you don't know about. Then all you have is typically a bunch of information. You might have a 2-column note, you might have a set of cards with information on them, but that's not an organizational plan for your writing. So then you need to take that information and you need to organize your ideas. We'll take a look at some examples of this. And now you're ready to draft, what we call the write stage or the drafting stage, where you need to translate that information that you gathered into sentences and sentences that make up paragraphs. And then once you get that draft down, you need to revise. You're reviewing your content, your organization, you're getting in your editing. And this is meant to be a recursive process. So when I think about my writers that struggled more with written expression, number one, they tended to not know writing was a process. So number one, writing is a process. Number two, they didn't treat this as a recursive process. They treated it more like a checklist where I took my notes, I filled out my graphic organizer, now I'm drafting. What if you get to the draft and you realize you didn't have enough information? I can remember one time my middle schoolers were writing about Ben Franklin and his role in the American Revolution. And one of my writers, Jarrett, he didn't have enough information in his notes about how Ben Franklin had a diplomatic relationship with the French. And he wrote like one line. And I remember when he was drafting saying to him, it seems like you don't have enough there to really develop the paragraph. And he said, well, we already took the notes. It's kind of like, well, we're already done with that stage. He's treating this as linear, check, check. It's really meant to be a recursive process. You might revisit various stages and flow between them rather than it's all done in lockstep order. So number one, writing is a process. Number two, it is a recursive process. And number three, writers that struggle more with written expression tend to mismanage the time. So about 40% of the effort for academic writing should be spent in the pre-write. About 20% of the time should be spent in the drafting, and about 40% of the time should be spent in revision, if that's where real writing happens. So if we took this in a simple Monday through Friday, if they were working on a piece Monday through Friday in class, not that they necessarily would be, but it's a clean number, all of Monday and all of Tuesday would be spent in the pre-write, in the thinking and planning. Then Wednesday, we would jot our ideas down and get a draft going. But then all of Thursday and all of Friday would be spent in revision. So one, writing is a process. Two, it's recursive. And three, you want to manage the time appropriately. And some of my kids that struggled with writing, they would spend about 10, 15% in the pre-write. All right, I'll fill out this organizer Miss Cotty gave me. And then they spent the other 80 or 90% in the draft. They put all the energy in the draft. When you don't plan to revise or spend a significant amount of time revising, it puts a lot of pressure on the draft. And they really kind of gas out drafting. And then they're not intending to revise. They've had it, right? So time management. This is just a different way of looking at that visual that I just sort of ran through there. But the time management also will go along with the aligning of support. So at Keys to Literacy and in classrooms we go in, we have this up, we have common language, we have a common visual. We tend to use the Post-it notes to kind of remind students how we're going to try to mostly manage our time when we do a piece. But the other part of this is getting some common strategies that can be used at these stages. So at the think, plan, write, and revise stage, what can end up happening is students have way too many strategies that they've seen, and it really becomes a bit of paralysis. So in supporting the writing process, a recommendation, a practical recommendation here, common visual, common language, but let's layer some common supports. Third piece here for supporting, some common supports for the writing process. So we're going to take a little tour here of taking that research-based recommendation that teaching students specific strategies for the stages of the writing process is a really good idea. It's a research-based instruction to do that. But one of the things that can result as we bridge that research recommendation over to practice is that students can end up in being exposed to too many organizers. Oh, how do you use the Post-it notes to help manage the time? I really just am using the Post-it notes for clarity on that to just sort of put up and remind students that we're trying for a 40-20-40. The Post-it notes on the right are reminding them of our key strategies, which we'll go through in a moment. So it's really just there to kind of visually help out. Hopefully that clarifies. So one of the things that ends up happening when we roll out strategies to support the writing process is students see a lot of strategies. I think graphic organizers is a big offender of this. Graphic organizers are great. They're steeped in research. They help the brain organize information and get it organized visually. But what ends up happening is students see a million graphic organizers. I think about it as the Benjamin Moore paint wheel problem. So the human brain loves choice, but choice is a paradox. So we love choice. We don't like to be told exactly this is the one way to do things. Think about the Benjamin Moore paint wheel, though, the problem here. I want to paint my dining room gray. I don't want to be told there is only functional gray, right? That's the only gray color you can work with. But I go into a Benjamin Moore paint dealership and I get the wheel, and there aren't 50 shades of gray, there are 200 shades of gray. And then what ends up happening is the students see so many different organizers because we're all using something different. A number of years ago, Pottery Barn teamed up with Sherwin-Williams to create these Pottery Barn paint strips. And they have like the 4 to 6 most popular colors in a hue. So you walk into a Sherwin-Williams dealer and you say, I want the Pottery Barn strip for gray. And you get like 4 to 6 popular grays. That reduced menu allows you to make a decision. So what I'm going to suggest here is we're going to look at not the Benjamin Moore paint wheel of possibilities, but more the Pottery Barn paint strip, Sherwin-Williams, of strategies that you can use in your classroom that support the writing process. For the think stage, we're going to look at 2-column notes. For the plan stage, we're going to look at topic webs. For the write stage, we'll give a little nod to templates and lists. And then in revision, we'll look at the importance of the revision being targeted. So let's do a little tour of some of this practical application. So at the think stage in the writing process, a main thing that goes on at that stage is you're gathering information. Now, where are we going to grab and store this information? I love a 2-column note. I use 2-column notes with 4th graders, 7th graders, 11th graders. Doesn't matter the graders. You can use a 2-column note. I can use a 2-column note if the source was a video, a teacher talking, an interactive lecture, an expository text, or a narrative text. So its wide applicability allows me to use it consistently. And when I use it consistently, students are then able to replicate it with greater independence, and they're able to become more skilled rather than worrying about how to use a different type of organizer every time. So these 2-column notes, they help generate, capture, and organize what students will write. We have quite a bit on our website about 2-column notes and some great blogs, but you get the gist of what they are. But picking it and using it consistently at that pre-writing stage, there is a real advantage to it. Here's a really simple everyday example. This would, of course, be more complex with your content. But if you were doing the 4 seasons, you have your topic across the top, big ideas on the left, details on the right. So very basic everyday example versus a heavier content example. But that's the gist of it. Now, students have to get good at paraphrasing and not copying sentences. They have to learn to abbreviate. They need to learn to develop their ideas further on the left. Those are all sub skills of note taking that are important, but it's a really good overall strategy at this pre-write stage. Then all students have is a bunch of information. Think about several pages of notes, right? They need to organize that information into what's coming at the opening of my writing, in the middle of my writing, and at the closing of my writing. We tend to call those things intro, body, conclusion. If it's narrative, we tend to call it beginning, middle, end. But a top-down web, what I like about it, it's also what I liked about the 2-column note, wide applicability. I use top-down webs with 3rd graders, 6th graders, 9th graders, 11th graders. They get more complex, but all writing needs to have the overall topic or controlling idea, what's going on. And then you need to decide what's going to go in the opening, the developing, and the closing of that writing. Here's a basic argumentative one. This one would more be like 7th grade when counterclaim and rebuttal start to come into play. But even if I was doing this with 4th grade and it was an opinion piece, I would do an opinion. In the middle, I would do my reasons. So a top-down web, you can use them over and over and over again, any content, any source, any type of writing. So it allows you to use it with a lot of repeated practice. It can be modeled by you. You can do it partially completed. Students can start to generate them on their own. You can do them digitally. You can do them by hand. And when it's expository, what that shares in common is the intro, body, conclusion. And then when it's narrative, we just flip it to say what's going to go in the beginning of your story, the middle, the end. You wouldn't have a resolution in the middle. It would come at the end. You wouldn't establish a setting in the middle. You do it at the beginning, right? And here is just that kind of simple everyday example. You had a bunch of notes about the 4 seasons, but what are you going to do in the beginning? Well, I'm going to introduce that there are 4 seasons. In the body, I'll talk about each season. This is the order I'm going to do it in. And then I'm going to conclude by saying that you end up having different clothes and sports and that go with the seasons. So it's basic example, but you get the gist. Then you get to the write stage. So we have 2-column notes at the think stage. We have top-down webs at the plan stage. And then a really good go-to at the write stage is sets of steps and templates. So sets of steps and templates are related because a template is really just a set of steps with room to do the step. But if you take a look here, this slide has a summary template versus a set of steps to write a summary. But what each of these do is they remind students about the type of writing. They remind them what is required in that type of writing or that task. Look at the how to write a summary. Number 1, read the material and figure out the main ideas. Number 2, make sure you write those ideas down somewhere. Don't hold them in your working memory. Number 3, start with an intro statement. So if I'm a student and I take a look at that, that's already out of the gate helping me know, oh yeah, summary is when you do main ideas. That's right, you have an intro statement. It's not a hook, it's not a thesis, it's not a lead. Over in the template side, it's also the set of steps, but with room to do the step. And some of my more struggling writers really benefited from a template because the idea was you need to write an intro statement, do it right here on these lines. You need to turn your main ideas into sentences, do that right here. Next, you need to add transition words, so it's just a little bit more scaffolded. But students became really used to that they either had a template that they could draft into or a set of steps that they could use as a checklist. And again, templates and set of steps work for every grade level and every type of writing, so you can use them pretty consistently. If we took our basic seasons example and we developed a template for it, what you see here is You'd have that overall topic sentence, you'd have your intro. Then I'm even just giving the students a couple starters. The first season with some lines to do it. The second season, I'm even adding the transitions in there for them. Now, not all students need this. I could just have a simple checklist of what we do when we write a descriptive piece, or you could also have the template as a lifeline for those that need it. But that is a third option or a third support. Think stages notes, plan stages webs. In the right stage, we have the set of steps and the templates, but all of those can be used very consistently across any grade level or classroom. And one of the unfortunate things I do observe as the grades go up is we start assigning a lot of writing. Write a descriptive paragraph about the seasons, or compare and contrast Jefferson and Franklin. And the task is given, but the process is not supported. They don't have somewhere to take notes that's organized. They don't have a template that's offered to more struggling writers. So we want to get away from just assigning writing as like a comprehension component of reading. Great thing to do, but we want to support the process of that written expression when we can with several of these practical strategies. Now, if we're in the revision stage, a recommendation here is to make sure that the revisions are targeted. So, three things that I like to always have on my list when students go to revise. Where is somewhere that you can sentence combine? Because that's something I do at every grade level, every classroom, every content area. Teach sentence combining. That is like the gold medal winner of sentence work that you can do. It's very steeped in research. But sentence combining, transitions, and they can always go back in and improve their vocab or their language choices. But if I focus on transitions, I'm giving a revision target. I would like you to go back through and focus on only these three things. And if I'm doing it, I'm giving a little bit of a support. So sentence combining, I do it all year long. So they end up with supports for that. I want you to go in and vary your transitions because some of you are missing transitions, or some of you are just writing also, or first, then next, first, then next. And I want you to vary that a bit. So I'll give a support, like a transition words sheet. We have several on the Keys to Literacy website, including this one. And then vocab and language. Where is the language, the vocabulary that we've been capturing for this science unit, or the notes we've been taking for this short story, where I can grab the specific language as part of my revision and go back in and improve that. So often when students are struggling bigger with organization or strengthening a thesis statement, they can only do so much when they're revising on their own without feedback or conferencing or direct targeted moves from you. But three things I find they can always do, because I work on them all year, every type of writing: sentence combining, transitions, the vocab or the language that you're using. So revisions being targeted. I want to take a look at here one other piece that helps support the writing process. So we just did a little carousel there of moving through think, plan, write, revise. We want to have common language, common visual, and some common supports at those stages. But I want to also give a little nod here for the adolescent level in particular, that supporting the writing process with writing assignment guides, or guides that set up really clearly for the writer what is involved in a piece. This partly has to do with writing is a little bit of an executive function nightmare at times, and how do we keep it all straight? So you can find these on our website, but I want to introduce the idea here to you. At the think stage, yes, you're gathering information, so you're doing 2-column notes. But you also are figuring out what's the task, who's the audience, what's my purpose. But often as teachers, we're not as clear as we think about task, audience, and purpose. And the writing assignment guide is a little planning tool to make sure that you're very clear out of the gate about those components. We know that research tells us that it's really important to set clear writing goals. If you go back into writing next or some of those reports, you'll see those recommendations. Make sure your writing goals are really clear. What's a practical way to do that? A writing assignment guide, or what we refer to as a WAG, giving students upfront out of the gate clarity around exactly what you want. So this is a planning tool that is simple, but it's transformative to think through ahead of time. The goal in these guides is to set clear expectations for students. But if I can give a little nod here, when you organize your writing assignment in one place, it streamlines things for interventionists. As a former interventionist, I'm giving a little plug here for that, and also for other teachers across departments or for parents or caretakers supporting students. Because here's what often happens. I would see students in academic support and they would bring to me a writing assignment, typically that was due yesterday by the time I was hearing about it. And the audience maybe wasn't well defined by the teacher. And I would say, "Who is this piece for?" And they would say, "I think it's for her," meaning the teacher. But she said, "Pretend like you don't know her." A little bit confusing. Or the due date would be in an agenda book, but the task or the prompt would have been on like a little half sheet of paper that got handed out, or maybe it was on the board. All the pieces that made up the assignment were all over the place rather than curated in one spot. So the writing assignment guide is a curation tool. And let me show you a couple quick examples. So this is a high school Algebra 2 teacher wanting the students to summarize what they've learned about solving for quadratic equations. But it's really different if the primary audience is someone that was absent yesterday versus am I writing this for the teacher? Because if you're writing it for the teacher, I would see some of my students, they would turn in a summary and they'd get kind of docked in the comments about not putting enough detail in there. And my students would say things to me like, "Isn't she the science teacher?" Which I think is a good point. So do you want them writing it like they're doing it for a student that was absent, or do they want you to be the audience? And then what's the length? This is a paragraph. And now I'm going to remind you, I'm going to leverage the tech piece here where I gave you a set of steps for how to write a summary, because summary is that's something we do often. I have a link here. If you're looking for some transition words to help you revise, right here. If you're looking for the little kind of mini rubric we have about doing summaries, open it up, take a check. If you want to look at a model of a summary, here it is. If you want to draft into a template, I've linked that for you. So here in one spot, a model, the rubric, the criteria for success, a template if I'm a student that feels like I need to access that. So this writing assignment guide is really important for setting those clear goals. This was an AP Bio teacher I worked with. He threw a little mini WAG together for students every week. We're working on a 1 to 2 paragraph analysis of a graphical data that he would put up, and it was not going great. So he ended up putting together that your analysis really needs to have these parts, and I'm going to be really clear about that. And I'm going to give you 2 annotated models that you can always click on if you want to refresh before writing your next one. And then in this notes piece, when the students clicked there and they opened it up, it was a little mini 2-column note that they could plan into. And then the student work ended up better as a result. So this was something they were doing anyways, but how can we curate and add some supports into one spot? Here is an ELA example. What's the task? What's the audience? What's the purpose? What's my length? What are some of the specific requirements? What's the criteria or the grading or the rubric for this? So you get the idea. So that's just a little nod to an extra support for the writing process is thinking about how are you making your assignments clear out of the gate. Now, we often get questions about, should peers exchange? And do you have any advice for collaboration and peer editing? And we could spend a whole workshop on just that topic. But we do have on our website, and I did throw up here for you, that my piece of advice would at least be make sure that if you're doing some active revision or editing between students, that you make that list active. So if students are exchanging and you're going to ask a question like, did they have varied vocabulary? Instead of yes, no, put a star where you see it, put a V where they could do it. Were transitions used? Circle transitions as you're reading, or put a T in the spot where you think this writer could use a transition to make it more clear. If it's digital, they could highlight. But they're going to be limited in what they really can offer feedback on beyond the types of things they've already learned to do as writers. So my advice here would just be to make sure that if editing is coming in as a stage, that you are making that interaction between the peers structured and active. Okay, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, and the motivation thing comes up quite a bit, especially at the adolescent level. And one of the things we know about human motivation, which is complex, is feeling prior success at something. So, one connection to motivation I'm hoping that I've made here is the things that I just showed you, how to approach the pre write with notes, planning with a web, sets of steps to remind. These are all things that set students up for more success. They don't have to like writing. A lot of people don't like writing. Most adults don't like writing. It's hard. Even people that are professional writers don't like writing. Read any Hemingway quotes, right? Hemingway is like the open your typewriter and bleed writer. That's one of his quotes. So when we think about variables of human motivation, feeling prior success with something, if you haven't been successful at something, I don't care if it's pan searing chicken or it's downhill skiing, you don't want to do it again. You have a lot of students by the time they're at the adolescent level, they haven't felt much success with writing. So the more we support the process, the more we demystify the process, the more success they'll feel and the more engaged you can make them. You might not make them intrinsically motivated to write, but you can engage them with an entry point. I do want to wrap up in these few minutes here with some motivation inspiration that is connected to audience. I have found nothing more powerful at the adolescent level than at times connecting students with authentic audiences. So, students writing for real audiences are motivated in a way that students turning out papers for a grade or an imagined audience or just for a teacher are not. You want students to, why don't they want to revise? Why don't they have skin in the game? Why aren't they persevering to revise another stage? Because is it for you with a rubric again? So Ann Rodier, who headed up the National Writing Project for a while, students have to believe that what they have to say is important enough to bother writing. They have to experience writing for real audiences before they will know that writing can bring them power. I want to circle back to the writing beliefs I began with, and that number one writing belief I put up, which is writing matters. But you can't just say that. They have to come to experience that writing matters. And where are there some places that they can write to authentic audiences? Where does their writing go beyond the teacher, possibly beyond the walls of the classroom? Can they write to members of the community, organizations, corporations, businesses, politicians, a family member? There are many platforms friendly to student writing exchanges and publication, and this is a game changer. Um, I tend to follow, I want to give you just a couple of examples here as we wrap up. I tend to follow student writers online. Several years ago, I followed Martha Payne. She's a little older now, but she was a fourth grader in Scotland who actually reluctantly wrote at school, but started a blog about her school lunch. It was called Never Seconds because she felt like they never got seconds and they didn't get enough food. And she started blogging and taking a picture of sort of the crappy school lunch and writing it up, giving it a review. And she didn't have to write. This wasn't an assignment for school, but what did she have? She had an audience. She had people that started paying attention to what she had to say about school lunch. And eventually, her blog, Never Seconds, it trends on Twitter. The local and national media start picking it up. And then Jamie Oliver, who's a big foodie guy, author, TV show, he sends it viral on Twitter. And the local council tries to ban Martha and say she can't take photographs of the school lunch anymore. And they can't tell her she can't blog. That's sort of Scotland's version of free speech. But what starts to happen is kids from all over the world start reading her blog and they start sending her pictures of their school lunch. And she had this post one day that her blog had become massive in Taiwan, and it was sent in by Annie. And she says, "This is a normal lunch. I look forward to seeing what's on my menu tomorrow." But what strikes me about this is many years ago when I was teaching, oh gosh, back in 2000, teaching fifth grade, I used to have my fifth graders do restaurant reviews and called Area Eats. And I would go around and I would collect gift cards from local restaurants, and we would send the kids out into the restaurants with their 2-column notes: food, atmosphere, service. They would learn how to write sort of persuasive pieces. But I had to print out all of their restaurant reviews, snail mail them to the businesses, bind them into a book that we put in the library, make like dorky announcements at the middle school that I worked in. If anyone wants to read Area Eats, go to the library. And look at the platforms that students have now to share what they're writing. And not every kid is Martha Payne, but these small victories, they really change everything. She went on to become Scotland's Food Blogger of the Year. She started a kitchen in Malawi for students that don't have school lunch at all. It takes on this whole sensation. But what did this kid have? She had an audience. So she wrote a ton. Let me give you two more real quick. I was working in a middle school and they made it a point to work with authentic audiences, and they wrote to the president of National Grid here in our state in Massachusetts, asking her to close down a power plant that in Plymouth that has nuclear energy, nuclear power plant. And they wrote to her, they made their case, and she wrote back. People tend to not write kids back a little thank you card. They really write to them. You just have to have a go. She addresses their points. We actually studied her letter for a rebuttal. We looked at her transitions, but look what she does at the end of the letter. "I was impressed by your argument, how you laid out your views, your writing. It's my hope that you keep this apparent curiosity of the world around you. We always need good, thoughtful employees. So finish your education and give me a call. I'd have you on my team anytime." Now some of these kids are going to engineering school because the writing mattered. It reached somebody and they got a response. I'll end with this one. The picture's a little bit blurry here, but this was my classroom back in 2001. It was on the heels of 9/11. Several troops were deploying in our area at the time, and my students were writing to soldiers, and there was someone on the other end of that letter. And we studied the American Revolution. We studied that we're an all-volunteer army, how our army began. And I had my most reluctant writers write 6, 7 letters because there was an actual audience. And this is my little Katie who I had that year, and she wrote a piece to the unknown soldier, the forgotten soldier, the missing soldier. And I ended up sending it into the local paper. It was published. And this is Mr. Papadopoulos. He showed up to my social studies class to speak to the students because he was so moved by what Katie wrote. I brought all the kids together, and I could have said all year long, writing matters. Let's sit up a little straighter, everybody. But this guy showing up and saying what he said about how the writing moved him, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. And he ended up giving Katie his Bronze Star from the Korean War in front of the kids. It was really powerful, and it happened because we moved beyond the walls of the classroom. So for time, I don't have time to share the other ones, but authentic audiences, what assignment can you target this year where students could write to a real audience? I just worked with a science class that was studying thermal energy, and they wrote to Hydro Flask about the water bottle that they wished could be designed, and the whole Hydro Flask team took a video, thanked them for their letters, sent them free Hydro Flasks. It works almost every time. How can you connect something that they're learning to an authentic audience? I would like to just leave that as a little note for motivation, inspiration. There's nothing that works better. I hope people found something that they could use, an aha, something that they could take back and implement. And I hope that we achieved our objectives that we started with here: writing beliefs, research recommendations, some practical strategies you can take back, and a little bit of a highlight of authentic audience. Hopefully, that inspires a few of you to think about that. There will be a part 3 on February 4th with my near and dear colleague, Lisa Klein, with a spotlight on sentence structure. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us.
Thank you so much, Shauna. That was amazing. I love your personal examples. It makes me want to go back to my fifth grade years when I was teaching fifth grade and just
Right?
implement so much. But thank you for joining us. We would love to have you join us at the Florida Reading League. If you're not already a member, you can go to our website, just Google Florida Reading League. We pop up and we would love to have you. We'd love for you to have an active part. Please reach out to me if you would like to be more active or if you have any questions, and we will definitely follow up and send out the link to part 3. And just thank you so much again. We really appreciate it, Shauna.
You're welcome. Thanks for joining, everyone.